The forgotten place. I can still hear the echo of our footsteps in that desolate place. It was Jake's idea to explore the unfinished building that had stood like a dark, looming shadow on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember. They had started construction years ago, some developer's grand dream, but it had been abandoned halfway through, leaving behind a skeleton of steel beams and concrete, a structure without a soul. The kind of place that kids dared each other to visit, only to chicken out at the last minute. Except tonight, we didn't chicken out. We had no business being there, not in the dead of night, but we were bored, and Jake was always looking for a thrill. "It's just an old building," he had said, grinning under the dim streetlights. "What's the worst that could happen?" The air was colder near the site, as if the building itself sucked in the warmth and kept it for its own. We slipped through a gap in the fence, the metal whining as it gave way, and made our way inside. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick concrete walls, casting long, eerie shadows that danced as we moved. We turned on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating dusty corridors and empty rooms. "Creepy, isn't it?" I whispered, half hoping Jake would agree and suggest we leave. But he just laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls, making the emptiness feel even more oppressive. "Don't be such a wuss, Mike," he teased. "This is the perfect spot for an adventure." The deeper we went, the more the building seemed to swallow us up. The floors creaked beneath our feet, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust. Every step felt like a mistake, but we kept going, drawn by that inexplicable need to prove to ourselves that we weren't afraid. That's when we heard it, the faint sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the shadows ahead, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. We froze, our hearts pounding in unison, as the realization hit us. We were not alone in that forgotten place. The legend of the worker. Jake's flashlight flickered for a moment, casting jittery shadows across the cold concrete. We stood still, the silence around us pressing down like a heavy weight. I wanted to turn back, to head for the exit, but Jake seemed unfazed. In fact, a twisted grin spread across his face as if he had been waiting for just the right moment to share something. "You know," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial, "there's a reason this place never got finished." I looked at him, trying to gauge if he was serious or just messing with me. His tone was different though, not playful, but darker, like he was tapping into something he'd been holding back. "Back when they started building this place," Jake continued, his words dripping with the kind of dramatic flair he loved, "there was this guy, one of the workers. No one remembers his name now, but they say he was off. Not just a little weird, but really messed up, you know? He was obsessed with the project, like he had something to prove, like finishing this building was the only thing keeping him sane." I shivered, more from the way Jake was talking than from the cold. "What happened to him?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Jake's grin faded, replaced by a shadow of something darker. "They say he started going crazy. People on the crew noticed that he'd be there all hours, working long after everyone else had gone home. But it wasn't just that. The other workers started getting hurt, tools would go missing, scaffolding would collapse, and no one could explain it. At first, they thought it was just accidents, but then—" Jake paused, leaning in closer as if the walls themselves were listening. "Then people started disappearing. First, it was just one guy, a new hire that no one really knew. Then another, and another. The project was cursed, or at least that's what the workers started to believe. They whispered that the guy was behind it, that he was sabotaging the build on purpose, making sure it would never be finished. A chill ran down my spine. Why? Why would he do that?" Jake shrugged, his expression a mix of curiosity and dread. "Who knows? Maybe he wanted the place for himself, or maybe he just didn't want anyone else to touch it. But here's the creepy part. After the disappearances, he vanished too. Just one day, poof, gone, without a trace. They say the company shut everything down after that, wrote it off as a loss. Too many bad things had happened, and no one wanted to work here anymore." The air around us seemed to grow colder, the building itself holding its breath as Jake spoke. "And now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they say he's still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for anyone stupid enough to come inside. He's the reason this place is forgotten, and he doesn't like it when people try to remember." Jake's words hung in the air, thick with menace. We stood in silence, the sound of our breathing too loud in the stillness. I wanted to laugh it off, to call Jake out for trying to scare me, but the look in his eyes told me he believed every word. And in that moment, so did I. The silence that followed Jake's story was oppressive, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heartbeat thunder in your ears. We had stopped walking, both of us too spooked to go any further. I could barely see Jake's face in the faint glow of his flashlight, but I could tell he was on edge too, his bravado from earlier slipping away. Then, from the darkness ahead, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, barely perceptible against the pitch-black interior of the building. But as our flashlights swept across the space, something reflected the light, two pinpricks of red, glowing faintly in the distance. They were too high off the ground to be anything natural, and they were fixed on us, unblinking. "Jake, do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't need to ask though. I knew he saw it too. The eyes burned in the darkness, growing brighter as they drew closer. And then we saw him, the figure of a man, tall and impossibly gaunt, his head tilted unnaturally to the side as if his neck had been broken. His clothes were torn and dirty, hanging loosely off his skeletal frame, and those eyes, they burned with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "It's him," Jake breathed, his voice barely audible. "It's the worker." For a moment, we were both paralyzed, too terrified to move. The man, if you could even call him that, stood there, watching us with those unholy eyes, his head tilting further as if he was examining us, trying to decide what to do next. Then, in a move that sent my heart into my throat, Jake took a step forward. "Hey," he called out, his voice shaky but determined. "We didn't mean to disturb you. We just wanted to see the place. We'll leave, okay? We'll go, and we won't come back. Just let us go." The figure didn't move. It didn't respond. But then, it began to chuckle, a low rumbling sound that grew louder and more manic with each passing second. The laughter echoed off the walls, filling the entire building, as if the darkness itself was mocking us. Jake faltered, his bravado crumbling. "Please, just let us go," he pleaded, his voice cracking. But the laughter only intensified, a horrible grating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, without warning, the figure lunged at us. In one swift, nightmarish movement, it reached out with arms that seemed far too long and grabbed Jake by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. Jake gasped for breath, his hands clawing at the air as he tried to free himself. "Let go," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. But the figure only laughed harder, the sound now distorted and inhuman, reverberating through the empty halls. And in that moment, I knew we were doomed. Before I could even react, the figure's other hand shot out, grabbing me by the arm and lifting me into the air. The world spun around me as I was hoisted off the ground, and I caught one last glimpse of Jake's face, pale, terrified, and then gone as the darkness closed in. The next morning, the town was abuzz with the news. Jake and I had disappeared without a trace. Our parents, frantic with worry, had called the police, who organized a search party. But no one dared to step foot in the unfinished building. The stories had resurfaced, the whispers of the cursed worker, and no one was willing to risk becoming the next to vanish. The building stood silent, its secrets buried deep within its concrete walls, and no one would ever know what happened to us that night. We had become part of the legend, another cautionary tale to keep the curious away. But deep inside the forgotten structure, the burning eyes still watched, and the laughter echoed on. The Ghost Unit's last mission. The legend of the forgotten building and its malevolent inhabitants spread like wildfire after Jake and I disappeared. The town fell into a hushed silence, with people avoiding even mentioning the place, let alone going near it. The police had long given up hope of finding us, writing us off as another tragedy in a town filled with too many. But not everyone was willing to accept our fate. His name was Captain Elias Hawthorne, a seasoned veteran and the leader of a covert military unit known as the Ghost Unit. They were a team of elite operatives trained to deal with the kinds of threats that most people didn't even believe existed. The supernatural, the paranormal, the things that go bump in the night, they were the Ghost Unit's specialty. And when he heard about the disappearance of two boys in a haunted, unfinished building, he knew it was the kind of mission his unit had been created for. Elias had seen it all, spirits that tore through dimensions, creatures that fed on fear, and curses that lingered for generations. But nothing had prepared him for the darkness that loomed over the forgotten building. Still, he knew he couldn't leave us to whatever fate awaited in that cursed place. So, he gathered his gear, strapped on his weapons, and set out alone. This was a mission he had to do himself. He arrived at the building just as the last light of day faded, the night air thick with an ominous stillness. The townspeople watched from a distance as he approached, too afraid to warn him or try to stop him. But Elias wasn't afraid. He had faced worse than this, or so he thought. From the moment he stepped inside, the building seemed to come alive, the air growing colder, the shadows deeper. It was as if the structure itself knew it was under attack and was fighting back. But Elias moved with the precision and calm of a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side. He began his search, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he methodically moved through the maze of concrete and steel. The night dragged on, each hour feeling like an eternity as Elias encountered things that defied explanation. Whispers in the walls, cold hands brushing against him, and the ever-present sensation of being watched. But he pressed on, undeterred, his resolve stronger than the fear that sought to consume him. As the clock struck midnight, he found the first signs of us. A piece of Jake's jacket, torn and dirty, clinging to a rusty nail. And then, further in, my flashlight, its battery dead, lying on the ground like a discarded toy. He was close, and the building seemed to sense it. The walls began to groan, the very air thickening with malice. And then, in the deepest part of the building, he found us. We were huddled together in a corner, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. The figure of the worker loomed over us, those burning eyes fixed on Elias as he entered the room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. But Elias didn't hesitate. "You want a fight?" he growled, leveling his weapon at the figure. "Come and get it." The next few hours were a blur of chaos and terror. The building seemed to twist and shift around Elias, trying to trap him, to break him. The workers' laughter echoed through the halls, a mocking, inhuman sound that sent chills down his spine. But Elias was relentless, cutting through the darkness with bullets and steel, driving back the shadows with sheer will. The fight raged on, neither side giving an inch. But as dawn approached, something began to change. The worker's laughter grew fainter, his form flickering as if he were losing strength. The building itself seemed to shudder, its walls trembling as the first light of morning began to creep in. By 5 a.m., the battle was over. The townspeople, who had watched in anxious silence all night, saw him emerge from the building as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Captain Elias Hawthorne was a mess, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a steely resolve. And in each of his hands, he held the small, trembling hands of Jake and me. We were safe, unharmed despite the horrors we had endured. As we stepped into the light, the building behind us seemed to sigh, the last of its dark power fading with the dawn. The curse had been broken, and the ghostly figure of the worker was no more. Elias didn't say a word as he led us back to the waiting crowd. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to reassure everyone that the nightmare was over. The townspeople whispered in awe as we passed, and though no one dared to ask what had happened inside, they knew one thing for certain: the forgotten building was no longer a place of fear. Captain Hawthorne had done the impossible. He had faced the darkness and won, bringing us back from the brink and ending the curse that had claimed so many before us. And as the sun rose higher, we knew we would never forget the man who dared to save us when no one else would.